Sure. So my name is Murray-Badal. I am here with Michael because of my connection to the Mosaic Project. The Mosaic Project is a nonprofit organization based out of Oakland, California. We work with people of all ages, from preschool students or elementary school students up to adults in the workplace. We talk about diversity and inclusion, but we're really an experiential education organization. And so our primary program is an outdoor school for 4th and 5th graders that intentionally brings kids from different cultural, economic, social backgrounds together, 3 different schools from 3 different backgrounds together, mixes them all up, and empowers them with skills about how to communicate across lines of difference with assertive communication and conflict resolution. So that's me. I've been involved with Mosaic for like 12 years now, and have kind of played every role there, and now I sit on the board. What about you, Michael?
Thanks, Cara. So Michael Baran here. Let me first just start off by asking everyone to mute themselves for now, if you don't mind, just so we reduce the background noise. And if you logged in video and I shut off your video, please don't take it personally. We love seeing your faces, but there's a lot of folks who are joining. So for most of this time, you're just gonna see me and Cara, and then we may have time for a small group breakout session where, if you want, you can be on video. But I'll just tell you really briefly about me. I am actually an advisory board member of Mosaic, have known Laura Mendel forever, and really excited about doing this with Mosaic. My background is a cultural anthropologist and cognitive psychologist, and I have been working in this space doing research, consulting on issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion for over 20 years now. So this is my life's work here, and really excited to share with you some of the things I've been thinking and writing about lately. So with that, I think we can get started. We were gonna just start with a little check-in. There's kind of a lot going on, Cara.
What? Yeah. There's a lot going on. I think it's a really obviously critical time where I think for those of us who have the inclination to get active, I want to, but also like feeling a little bit like emotionally drained. And, I feel very privileged. Like, everyone I love is safe and taken care of, but also as a Black woman, you kind of also feel like it could be, it could be anyone. And you also feel like a real kinship to like the folks who've died, who've been killed. And so it's an intense time for sure. What about you, Michael? How are you feeling?
Yeah, so many things. I'm not going to get into all of it.
Fair.
It's, but this is this space I live in. I work and live in this space of issues related to race, racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and have for the last 20 years, right? So there's a lot of ups and downs. There's a lot of pain, there's a lot of sadness, there's a lot of frustration, and it doesn't affect me in the way that it does others as a white man, right? So it affects me in different ways. And so out of all the things I'm feeling right now, one of the things I'm feeling is just kind of confused and fascinated and bewildered. For 20 years, right? I've been doing this work, and others have been doing this work, and activists and academics and researchers and all kinds of people trying to get people to pay attention to these issues that we're going to talk about today. And a lot of people were in it, and a lot of people are like, yeah, whatever. Things are kind of okay. I'm not going to get worked up about this. And seeing those same people turn on a dime to get motivated and to stop being silent, and seeing things like statues coming down, and Confederate flags being banned from places, and like the speed at which things are happening is a little bewildering and exciting and intense. So that's a long answer. I'm also really grateful to be sharing this space with all of you. There's so much happening, and it's nice to connect. I mean, that's another part of this, right? We're in the middle of all this COVID social distancing stuff. And so just being able to connect with you all and have this space where we talk about this in a real deep level is great.
My friend says we're physically distant, but we should not be socially distant. So hopefully we get to feel socially close today.
Absolutely, yeah. So let's take just 1 second for everyone on the call to just kind of take a breath together, check in with yourself. Like, how are you feeling? Just acknowledge that, honor that. And for us all to recognize that we're all showing up here to these next 90 minutes with very different experiences and very different perspectives and very different emotions around all of this. And so just kind of taking a minute to acknowledge that. Cara and I were talking earlier about how we'd love to hear how you're all doing, and to have a whole listening, processing session and have it just be that. And maybe we'll get to do that too at some point. But just taking a moment to acknowledge all of that, and ask you, to be present with us as we go through. We're going to go through a lot of material, and so we're not going to do any one piece of it justice. But there's so many things we want to talk about. So get ready. And thank you. Those of you who are sharing your feelings in the chat, thank you for that. We do see that. So please feel free during this whole presentation to type into that chat box. All right.
Yeah, I see Heather saying all of her emotions have been heightened during quarantine. Absolutely.
Yes.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and jump in here with, hopefully this is all going to work well together, but Michael's book, I think, is incredible, and it's Subtle Acts of Exclusion, and you're going to talk about it a lot, so I won't try to own your book. But as we talked about subtle acts of exclusions, which are also sometimes referred to as microaggressions, and thinking about the context under which that lives, I just thought it was important to bring up why we're talking about that in the midst of violence. And there's probably, maybe some of you have seen this before. It goes discrimination, or prejudice leads to discrimination, leads to violence and war. And at the Mosaic Project, we talk about how segregation leads to ignorance and fear leads to prejudice. So it's not just like prejudice comes from nothing, right? It comes from being separate, and then the ignorance and fear that are derived from being separate. And I think the subtle acts of exclusion really fit well, like the unconscious bias, the structures that affect people, which I know you're going to talk about, that really fits into those lower rungs of what happens when we really don't understand one another. And the fact that these things perpetuate one another. So it's segregation leads to ignorance and fear, leads to prejudice and discrimination and violence. And then those things all help go back to the bottom and create more segregation and separation, more ignorance and fear. And so the reason we're talking about these subtle acts of exclusion right now is to talk about the fact that these things are all deeply interconnected, and the interpersonal way that we handle that matters as well. It's not the only thing that matters. There's lots of ways, which I know you'll talk about as well, but it's one of the ways. And so the other thing is, like, we can't just be like, oh, we want to end segregation. We also have to, transform it and create something new. So if you click over to the next slide, the thing that we're trying to do is create a pyramid of peace. So we're trying to build connection instead, right? We're trying to build connection, and we'll talk about this idea of respect so that we actually have a peaceful world. And we're not thinking about peace as like some utopic thing. It's like, these are the actions we take all the time to, create a world where we can actually thrive and it feels equal and equitable amongst different people. So that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, that's great, and ties exactly into what we really want to focus today, which is obviously there's a lot of visible, horrific things that we're seeing, right? And there's a lot that's invisible too, that we still need to keep focusing on. If we're really thinking about racial justice, if we're really thinking about racial equity, this isn't something that's going to change in a minute, no matter how fantastic and successful protests are, right? We're talking about like a paradigm shift, a seismic shift, moving from a culture that has valued whiteness and white people. And, white is good, white is normal, white is like accepted. And if we're talking about moving to a place for real, where that's decentralized, where everyone can be considered equally valued and respected and heard and understood, that's gonna take some work and some time. And so there are some powerful things sitting at the bottom of that pyramid that you showed, Cara, that we're going to talk about today. Structures, biases, and subtle acts of exclusion. So we're going to focus some time really understanding those, going over those, and then moving to, okay, what are some things we can do to disrupt that? Some concrete and actionable strategies for making a difference now, yes, right? And building a better future. So those are some of our goals. Any goals you would add there?
I think that sounds great. Let's get into it.
Okay. All right, so before we get into it, Cara mentioned this book that I co-authored that just came out in March. So we're gonna get into the ideas of the book. Before we get into the ideas, want to make sure to acknowledge and credit my co-author, Tiffany Jana. We've known each other for ages and just had a fantastic experience thinking and writing together about this issue. So Tiffany couldn't be here with us today, but we acknowledge their contribution. All right, so the three things I think I mentioned that we really want to focus on: structures, unconscious bias, and subtle acts of exclusion. So structures, right? I am not going to spend nearly enough time talking about this. We could have 90 minutes on each one of these easily, right? What I want to make sure we're all just keeping in mind is structures and how they lead to unequal outcomes for certain groups over others, right? And this is critical, and they're all related, right? So I've got wealth, housing, education, health, and criminal justice. I mean, just to give you just one example, right? Like Black people systematically being denied loans to buy their homes in certain neighborhoods. So they had to rent, so they didn't build up equity. So wealth didn't accumulate, didn't get passed down to different generations. Then the property values are affected so that the tax base in certain areas leads to less funding for schools in certain areas. These areas have housing that is not as healthy, so you start to have health outcomes that are unequal, lower access to healthy foods, disproportionate policing in certain areas because of all these things and the visibility of it all. So this is a part where I'm not going to go into that much detail, but just put it up there to remind us all of how important this is. That when we see isolated incidences, that we recognize there are these deep structures underlying it all. I've done focus groups and research for years and years and years, asking people how they think this all works. And it's been pretty amazing and almost consistent that you have these cultural models of how it all works. And if you ask people why are there differences in education attainment, or why are there differences in wealth? People have this model of it's individual choices and individual decisions. And it's like, if you're not making it, it's your own fault, because pull yourself up by your bootstraps. No one's handed me anything. I've worked hard for everything I've gotten. And so it's this model of understanding the world that's really about individuals and individual decisions and individual work and individual values. And that's not how it works. So the other thing I've done is interview experts who study this, right? Scientists who study this. And you ask them, how does it all work? They're never saying that. It's all about the underlying structures and the underlying history and how it's all related. And so that's really important. If we want to look at, large scale changes in now and in the future, these are things we really need to focus on. Mm-hmm. What would you add, Cara, there?
I was just going to add that, as we get into these subtle acts of exclusion, thinking about the structures as the invisible forces that have helped to create all of the interpersonal too. I mean, back to the pyramid of each of these things leads to, individuals who've been deeply impacted and affected. And it's hard because we do have individual choices. Like, obviously each of us makes a choice, and there's something going on in the background that is maybe harder to acknowledge, especially if you've benefited from the structures in place.
Yes. And they're largely invisible, especially if you benefited, right? I mean, this was striking. We would sometimes do focus groups, and I'm thinking of ones we did on the criminal justice system specifically, asking white people about how it works, these disparities in statistics, and asking Black focus groups the same questions, and finding that often the people that were most affected understood the issue in very similar ways to the experts, because they're living in it, right? And people who were least affected had more of these cultural models of individual choice and pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Thank you for adding that.
Totally.
All right. So now that's the fastest summary of
of structural oppression.
Structure inequalities. Yes. Yeah. Just think it's very important to mention and talk about. And I want to talk about this other stuff too, because this was where my research was really focused. So unconscious bias, right? What is it? And don't even read this definition. I want to describe what it is by giving you an example first. So this is a really famous example you might have heard about before. But in the mid-1900s, if you look at these real prestigious orchestras, city orchestras, New York Philharmonic and things like that, they're almost all men, right? In the mid-1900s. So think about how this all happens, right? Someone walks up on stage, they play their music, a jury of people is sitting in the audience, and they're the ones making the hiring decision, right? Do we want to hire this person for our orchestra? So if you ask those people in the audience, hey, are you just trying to hire men here? What do they say? No, of course not. We're the New York Philharmonic. We got to hire the best musician possible, right? We're trying to be the best orchestra in the world. We're not trying to hire just men. We're trying to hire the best musicians, right? And they're not lying, right? That's what they really think they're doing. Then some researchers had this idea, just what if there's something unconscious going on that they don't even realize? So they put up a big screen at the front of the stage, and they had the musicians walk in behind the screen, play their music, and then they looked at what happened, right? So the first thing when they did this is they found there was no change, and they're puzzled, right? Why is there no change? We were sure there was something going on here. And they realized that you could still hear women's high heel shoes walking up on the stage. And so they weren't seeing the people, but through their ears, they still categorized people as men or female, male or female. So then they had people take off their shoes and walk in on a carpet, play their music from behind the screen, and just like that, more women got hired, because the bias wasn't affecting the decision. All of a sudden, you really were just listening to the music. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. One, because you often hear people saying, yeah, you know, sure, they're stereotypes, but, you know, they're basically true. Like, it's basically a good shorthand. And what this so clearly illustrates is, no, like the bias was actually making you make a worse decision, right? Because of the bias. And so that's really important. And also an important metaphor for if you recognize that everyone has bias, which everyone does have these unconscious biases, and I'll get into that more. We all do, whether we're talking about gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, religion, weight, whatever it is that you're talking about. We all have these unconscious biases, right? If there is anyone that doesn't, just type that into the chat. Anybody who doesn't have
clarify, not type that into the chat.
I know, but I have been in rooms where people say they don't, but we all do, and that's been shown through research, right? And so it's a metaphor. That screen is a metaphor for recognizing that we have it, that it's not going to disappear tomorrow. What can you do to block it so it doesn't affect decisions you have to make, right? Whether that's in your, you know, in your job or in your life. So that's unconscious bias, right? A lot of people just, I'm sure lots of you have heard that term. People use it to kind of mean anything, right? But it's really specific. It's the bias you're not conscious of. If I said to you, what are your unconscious biases right now? Type that into the chat, right? You wouldn't be typing in unconscious biases because you're conscious of them. All right, so this is important. Why do we have it? Because a lot of the times the stuff you see getting like passed around on social media, talking about unconscious bias, they get it kind of wrong. They get it partly right and partly wrong. Because a lot of times what they say is, well, we all have these unconscious biases because we're human. That's just the way it is, right? And that's partly true, right? We categorize people because we're human. That's true, right? Our brains work like that. Our brains process information particular ways, quick ways. We can't think about all the stimulus that we're bombarded with every second. We can't really process that in a way. Our brains have to do some automatic thinking. That's true. But the fact that we associate some groups of people with good and others with bad, or some with high potential and some with low potential, or some with violent, others with not violent, because that is all cultural. And I want to talk about where that comes from, okay? So let's talk for a second. I know this group is largely interested in children. Maybe you have kids that went to Mosaic or something, so that hopefully this will be interesting to you. I get fascinated by this stuff. If you think about a tiny little child, 0 to 3 years old, right? Their brains are growing at an astonishing rate. When I started talking about this work, years ago, I did a lot of work with the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, and they had this statistic that they talked about, that a child's brain from 0 years old to 3 years old is forming 700 synaptic connections per second. And that number used to blow me away, right? And then they got more fine-grained tools to test this. And now they talk about how they can show that a child's brain from those 0 to 3 years is forming 1 to 2 million new synaptic connections per second, right? So their brains they're surrounded in this culture and by people who are caring for them, and their brains are literally building the foundation for everything they're gonna understand later in life. And we have this idea, well, how did they learn about race, right? I don't teach them about race. How do they learn about race? We have this idea, and psychologists actually have this idea, that they just look out across the world and they see difference, right? They see color difference and they form categories. And then they go and figure out who fits into what category. And what researchers figured out is that that's actually kind of impossible, right? If you think about the way we all look physically different, there aren't bounded, clear groups. There's a whole spectrum of difference along any physical feature you want to talk about, right? And so if they were to look out, they wouldn't see bounded groups, they would see gradations, spectrums, right? And so it kind of be impossible to form categories visually like that. And so what we realized is they form those categories by language. So take this woman here, her child's looking kind of bored, like he's not paying any attention or she's not paying any attention. And the mom or the caregiver might be saying something like, yeah, you know, I'm excited. He's gonna have a Black preschool teacher next year or something, right? I think the kid's not paying any attention. And the kid actually learned a ton about the world from that simple little utterance, right? You weren't trying to teach them, but their brains are trying to seek out in that information. So their brain hears that and is like, what, right? Every other time my mom said the word teacher, it didn't have a color in front of it. There's something different about this category. And there's a category of people called Black, and they form a little cognitive placeholder. They don't know what that means. They don't know who fits into that category, but now they've got the start of a category of people that their brains are then gonna go filling in, right? And they learned my mom's excited about it or nervous about it or feeling something about it. And so it's really important, right? So their brains are on heightened alert for those kinds of things. So that's happening. Meanwhile, if the child starts to ask about it to an adult, a teacher, or a parent, and here I'm talking about white children and white parents for the most part, right? We know that parents of color, Black, Indigenous, parents of color, they don't have the luxury of not talking about race with their children.
It's 17 hours.
I'm so sorry. My computer wants us to know what time it
is. Good. Your computer's keeping us on track. But white parents often will not talk about race with their children. Their kids might even ask questions, and white parents will go through these like mental gymnastics to not talk about it with platitudes of, we're all equal, you know, we treat everyone the same, move on, right? And I mean, it's so extreme. There's a study I often talk about where this is written in the book Nurture Shock by Poe Bronson and Ashley Merriman, where they wanted to do this study where they looked at what was more impactful for children developing ideas of like multiculturalism. Was it a Sesame Street clip on multiculturalism? Was it parents talking about those same sorts of things with a politically approved like PC script that they were going to read from? Or was it both of those things? So I often ask people, which one do you think it was, right? And we're not in the room together, so I can't hear your responses, but people often get mixed. Maybe Sesame Street, maybe both. The truth is, we don't know, and we may never know, because all white parent who had been given a script of what to say dropped out of the study because they didn't want to talk about these things with their children, even when it was all approved by people who study this stuff. So there's a real, so here you've got on the surface, explicitly, we're all the same, we're all equal. And under the surface, children's brains are picking out information. Well, okay, if adults won't talk to me about it, then my brain will find that information elsewhere. My brain will pick out information from what I see on TV, what's on the news, what is in movies, what's in billboards, what about people who say stuff around me? What about when my parents lock their car door going by certain people and not others, right? Their brains are picking out all those subtle cues. And so you get explicit, we're all the same, unconsciously, you get bias.
Yeah, I think that really relates well to like the work that we do with Mosaic. And so part of my job used to be to go to parent meetings and talk to parents about why they should send their kids to Mosaic. And very often I would get like one of two responses. One was like, we already talk about this. We don't, like, we know, my kids know that everyone is equal and we talk about it. Or like they're too young, they're not ready to start talking about these issues. But the fact of the matter is that children start showing bias very, very early. Maybe, like there's definitely studies around as early as 7, maybe as early as 2. Like they are, to your point, recording information from a very, 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 very young age about the world. And if we're not talking to them, then we're leaving them to the devices of our society, right? Where there's tons of, like, back to your structures, tons of stereotyping, tons of differences that are being presented to us without even realizing it. So unless we're talking to them about it, then what they're picking up are the things that are already being presented to them, which are often completely inaccurate and often prejudicial.
Yeah, and some of those things are so subtle that people don't even notice they're there, right? And that's, or just think, oh, that's just, I'm thinking about Disney movies that have a lot of subtle messages about race and gender, especially the older ones.
Oh no, not Disney.
You don't want me to destroy Disney for you, Cara? All right.
Drink my water.
we won't talk about that. We'll save that for another time. Okay, so now here you have the situation then where you've got a child who's starting to develop these patterns of thinking, these unconscious biases. And then I put this infographic here on the right. Of course you can't read that, don't even try. It's been passed around social media a lot. The idea is it shows all the different cognitive biases that our brains have, right? And so I know, Cara, you wanted to talk about some of this.
Well, yeah, I was just going to call out selective attention bias in particular. That's something we talk a lot about with the kids, and I don't know if parents are on the call. It's something that they can really understand, and it's, the way that we explain it to them is about seeing what you expect to see and not seeing what you don't expect to see. So the example that we always often give is if you have a stereotype that all kids who wear glasses read during lunchtime. Then when you go out into the playground, you'll see, wow, look at all those kids with glasses reading during lunchtime. But you don't notice that there are kids who have glasses on who are playing basketball. There are kids who have glasses on who are on the play structure. And you also don't notice that there are lots of kids who aren't wearing glasses who are also reading. The selective attention bias is us looking for the things that we want to see and not looking for the things that we don't want to see. And this idea of perpetuating stereotypes, which I think is a pretty popular thing, is like, oh, this is a stereotype that's being perpetuated, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment also. Like this idea of the stereotype being perpetuated is a myth, right? Because it's our brain looking for the thing we expected and confirming our own biases. That's something that happened entirely in my brain. It didn't really have anything else to do with the people who were committing the perpetuation of the stereotype. That all happened inside of my own brain, which is why it's so important to catch yourself when you find a stereotype and you start enforcing the stereotype, which we'll also talk about more when we get to solutions.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, really helpful. Okay, so what are consequences of this unconscious bias? Because they're huge, right? So I know, Cara, you wanted to give one example here in terms of schools.
Well, yeah, I've seen many a school, but I was thinking about an example of at the Mosaic project. As I mentioned, we have kids from very different backgrounds come together in different schools, and each class comes with their teacher. And because schools are so segregated in the Bay Area, even though we mostly work with Bay Area schools, it's not very hard to get a very homogeneous upper income, mostly white school, and to also have like lower income schools, which unfortunately are often made up of Black and brown students. Like that happens all the time. And there was one week in particular where two Black boys got in a fight, and it was fine. They got in a fight, which, happens when you're dealing with children and feelings and all of those things. And then they did conflict resolution, which is a part of our curriculum, and they did it beautifully, and they resolved the conflict. But later on, Laura, who's our executive director, was talking to one of the teachers from one of the upper income white schools, and he was like, yeah, it was so great. Like the kids learned so much. I just wished you had sent those two Black boys home because they reinforced my kids' stereotypes about little Black boys. And that was like when we realized that, like, oh man, we really have to make sure we're nailing down how we're teaching this, because our teachers did not recognize that, like, first of all, the kid who we almost sent home that week was one of his little girls, a white girl who had been causing havoc all week long. And the only reason she didn't go home is because she did most of it on Thursday night. And it was like too late, the week was ending. But he was saying like, oh, these two Black boys almost ruined the experience. But like really the person who had been more fundamental to hurting the experience of the kids was one of his own students. And I mean, that's what we mean when we're saying you're seeing what you expect to see and not seeing what you don't expect to see. Like he completely ignored what was very blatantly in his face in favor of this. And I have no idea if his kids actually perceived it that way. But you know what, based on what you're saying, like kids expect to learn all the time. They spent an entire week learning about differences, and it's quite possible that they did not actually interpret it the way that he interpreted it, but he had a very specific lens based on the fact that he had a perception of little Black boys. And that's, which is why we've really shifted our curriculum to talk about the fact that unconscious biases are something that everybody has and that we have to take pause in order to be able to break that apart, which again, we'll talk more about later. But yeah, school.
Yeah, well, that story, it makes me think of a study I sometimes talk about, which, you know, I think is related to everything, you know, that's going on today too. But this is a study that really is just gut-wrenching. This was done at Yale, and they asked preschool teachers to watch a 10-minute video of 4 children playing. 4 young children playing. There was a Black boy, a Black girl, a white boy, and a white girl. And they were just playing. And they asked the teachers to find the problematic behavior. And there wasn't any, right? In this 10-minute clip or whatever. But the real study was that they tracked the teachers' eye movements. These are preschool teachers. They watched the Black boy almost the whole time, right? That's unconscious bias, where when you're doing that, you know, you're going to find problematic behavior at a disproportionate rate, right? Even when it's not being committed at a higher rate. And so it's really devastating. And of course, there's so many ways that unconscious bias plays out in schools. Who gets pushed in certain subjects, you know, who gets challenged and who isn't expected to do really well. There's so much.
Well, I was going to say that there's also, you're going to work now, like obviously there's research about how in workplaces, Black people are also more closely watched by their supervisors, so that the pattern that happens in schools happens in work. And I think a lot of Black kids get told when they're young that they have to be twice as good and work twice as hard. And it's like, unfortunately, there's a lot of evidence that that's true, because they're being watched far more closely for their work, micromanaged in a different way, and their managers are more likely to remember their mistakes when they make them.
Yeah, so it affects performance reviews, affects promotions, affects who gets trusted with the big projects. There's one study which many of you may have heard about, this famous resume study, where they took the exact same resume, like same education, same work experience, word for word, the same resume, and they just changed the name on it. So half of them got a white sounding name and half of them got a Black sounding name. And then they sent them out across the city to different jobs, and same resume, right? And the ones with the white sounding name got 50% more callbacks for interviews. 50%, not a small number.
No.
And these are people evaluating resumes who, if you ask them, are you trying to just hire white people? They would say, most likely, not only am I not just trying to hire white people, if anything, I'm trying to hire not white people. I'm under pressure to increase diversity. And yet, that still happens. 50% more callbacks.
Well, there's also, so I didn't mention before, but I'm a dual degree student at the Wharton School in their MBA program, and the Harvard Kennedy School in their Master's in Public Administration. And one of my advisors there, Corinne Lowe, does research on this topic as well. And she actually worked with a bunch of the top hiring companies, because one of the critiques is that said, he's like, oh, you just sent it out through Indeed or whatever. Like, obviously there's going to be problems. It's just like a random thing. But she actually worked with a bunch of different firms and ask them like, okay, I'm going to send you MBA resumes. You're going to like pick which ones you like and send them back to me. And like the purpose of the study was for them to be able to tell them like what kind of traits they like. But also for her to be able to track, like if there were indicators that a person was Black or brown or a woman in the resume, would it be less likely? And almost the exact same results where even when these companies knew they were being watched, were being asked to be careful. We're talking specifically again about diversity and inclusion. The people who were reading the resumes automatically put down resumes that had mentions of like a African-American student association or a women's club or a sorority. Right. Automatically those resumes were dropped.
Oh, wow. I need to read that study. It's really
Corinne
interesting.
Lowe, she's awesome.
Okay, I'm going to check that out for sure. And then, there's so much unconscious bias that comes in day-to-day life. I mean, there's obviously, to say that, for example, police officers have unconscious bias should not be in any way controversial. We've already gone through in great detail how we all have unconscious bias, right? So that shouldn't be anything controversial. And it's clear from research, right? So one study I'm thinking about, they analyzed 700,000 police stops and found that it was Blacks and Latinos were way overrepresented in terms of who was getting stopped and searched. And it was the whites that had way more like contraband, right? So again, the bias is, they might say, we're just going with our gut. We know, like we're, it's like profiling, right? We know in our gut, right? But this is showing that bias is actually making them do their job worse. Another case of that. They repeated that in the big Ferguson research report that came out, same exact results. So that's obviously tremendously serious consequences, right? When people like police officers and teachers, because of the fact that we all have these biases, we have to take it so seriously. I mean, because of the way that these people interact with others, right? If you look at medical professionals, same thing, right? We know unconscious bias makes it so that like African Americans are given less pain medication for the same exact symptoms that a white patient might come in with. That's hugely problematic. Related to things like infant mortality, which is way higher for African Americans than white people. There's another study that makes this so clear too. They did this study where they found in cities that were playing a big sports, their sports team was playing in a big game, like a playoff game or something. If that team lost, the next day they analyzed the court sentencing in the courts, and they found that the sentences were harsher the day after a sports team lost. But do you think that was done equally across the board? No, it was not. Disproportionately harsher for non-white people, right? Unconscious bias coming into play with huge consequences for everyday life. And, financial consequences too. I often talk about the study that Malcolm Gladwell talks about, where they took people and trained them, dressed them up, and gave them the same clothes, same backstory, same script, same negotiating techniques, and sent them out to buy the same new car at different dealerships. And to make a long story short, basically, the Black folks got charged an extra $1,000 for the exact same new car because of these unconscious biases. So serious consequences to this unconscious bias, right? That people don't even realize they have.
The comments are going kind of crazy over here, Michael. I don't know if you're seeing them, but someone, I think Kimness asked about why white people have such a hard time talking about this. And I see Fred talking about how it's a very American idea of self-sufficiency and making it without help. So if anyone has benefited, which they have, makes people feel defensive and uncomfortable.
Yes. So there's obvious benefits. Sometimes I liken this to that age when you're kind of sure your kids must know about Santa Claus, that he's but they're not telling you, like they're acting like they still believe in it. And sometimes I think they're just like, I got a great thing going here. Why would I mess that up? Like, this is great. And there's a lot written about this too, right? So there's some research showing that, you know, a lot of the not talking with children specifically is this real, his desire to have a better future, to like, if I don't talk about this, then maybe they won't learn racial discrimination and they'll grow up to really, you know, treat everyone equally if I don't point it out, right? Or just an uncomfortability with talking about anything hard with children, which I've seen, like talking about death or talking about abuse, or, you know, people have a real resistance talking about any of that with children. And, you know, then there's all the stuff that people are talking about with white fragility these days. And I don't, you know, there's a lot there. Okay. Should we get into subtle acts of exclusion?
The title of your book, yes.
All right. Okay, so I wonder how many of you have heard of this word microaggressions. I've done some research and lots of people have not ever heard of this word. Cara and I were laughing because literally right before this session started, my phone popped up with an NPR news story like microaggressions. So maybe more and more people are starting to know about it, but a lot of people don't. A lot of people have kind of heard about it, but don't know what it means. And a lot of people have a totally wrong idea, or I mean, wrong is not the same idea that I have. They're like, oh, it's like micromanage, right? And then some people, of course, you know, pretty much understand what it is. Yeah. I don't take for granted.
Who know? I see Jasmine knows, Jenna knows. There's a few.
Yes.
I'm not doubting it.
Yes. No. And but we'll talk about it anyways, just to get all on the same page. So this was some research done by Kim Kayun, where she went around and asked people to write down, you know, what are the most common microaggressions that you hear. And so I'll read these for you, starting on the left. So like, what are you? Can you see as much as white people, you know, because of your eyes? Why do you sound white? Or you don't speak Spanish? So these are things, you know, microaggressions are often defined as things that people aren't necessarily intending to be cruel or exclusionary or hateful. You know, they're just trying to be curious or give you a compliment even, or to bond with you, or to find out more about you. And yet it's not having that impact, right? It's having a different impact. It's making people feel excluded. So these are a serious issue, right? These really threaten inclusion. Inclusion, I don't want to assume people know what we mean by that, because a lot of times you hear people talk about diversity and inclusion as if it's sort of one thing. Diversity, just to get everyone on the same page, diversity, the way we think about it, is it's all about the who. It's the people. Who do you have in the room? What are the demographics? Like the different kinds of people in all the different dimensions of diversity. How are we similar and different along all these different dimensions? Take any two people, take any one person. There's no such thing as a diverse person. There's a person with, but you hear this, right?
Yeah, no, I read an essay for an MBA program that was like, I'm the only diversity. I was like, you by yourself.
Right. So a person is just a person with all these dimensions of their identity, but any two people, you put them together, there's always some diversity, right? Even genetic twins, there's some diversity there. And so that's what we mean by diversity. Inclusion, on the other hand, is about how we relate to one another. Is everyone feeling welcomed, valued, respected, heard, understood, right? It's about how you feel. And it's something we all have to do actively. A lot of people think they're inclusive in their mind. I respect everyone, right? But it's about whether the other person feels it. So there are things you can do to make them feel that. So these microaggressions are threatening inclusion, and they keep happening. These are the kinds of things, there's research done showing like some areas of diversity and inclusion and representation and equity, some areas are making progress. You look at microaggressions and it's like no progress, right? And so, so they're a serious issue and they're threatening inclusion. They're affecting people's health, actually. Like that's how much they're affecting people. Now, what I would find doing workshops is that because they're so serious, we try to get people to understand them and we talk about some common examples. And on one hand, we'd find that so many people got really defensive. Like, I don't even think that's a microaggression. How would you even know if you don't know the person's intention, right? So the term itself is focusing people's attention on an intention rather than the impact that it had on the other person. And so it's creating this defensiveness. And, which is even a bigger deal, it's signaling to everyone that these aren't really a big problem. It's a tiny little thing, right? And so here we are, we're trying to make progress on an issue which is really complicated and requires a lot of empathy and understanding and listening and openness and dialogue. And maybe the term itself is making that even harder for us. So Tiffany, Jana, and I got together and we said, what could we call these instead, right? Okay, there was a period where I'd be giving talks and I just kind of mumble out under my breath, like, someone needs to think of a new term for this. And then at one point I was like, okay, well, let's just do that then. So what Tiffany and I came to call these is just subtle acts of exclusion. First, they're subtle, right? A lot of times they are, a lot of times they're not. Right. And especially if they're happening to you, they might not feel subtle at all, but sometimes they are. Right. And that's sometimes what makes them really hard to identify and speak up about. That's the challenge. You're like, wait, was that what did that, and then the moments pass and you decide not to say anything at all. Right. They're acts, right? They're not intentions. It's not an intention and it's not a character judgment. It's just a thing you said or did. And we can talk about that without you having to get so shameful or feel like you're being called a bad person. It's just something you said and we can talk about that. And what's the problem with them? The problem is they create the opposite of inclusion. They create exclusion, right? In the moment, they make people feel excluded and they contribute and perpetuate to a system where people of marginalized identities are continuously excluded, right? So it's a serious problem. So that's why we came up with this idea, subtle acts of exclusion. And one of the really important things we wanted to do is figure out, so I did research looking across all the different examples of subtle acts of exclusion I could get my hands on, from the literature, from our experiences, from people that have talked to us. I did 100 interviews with people on the street with a videographer who would videotape people, and I would ask them questions about what they experienced. Looked across all of the different examples, whether they related to disability or race or gender or sexuality or weight or religion, anything, right? Looked across all of them and tried to isolate what are the most common things that are being subtly communicated under the surface, right? On the surface, you might be saying, where are you really from, right? It's a question, maybe a question you want to know more about someone. You want to find out about their life. That's what it is on the surface. Underneath the surface, what's being communicated or conveyed? You don't belong, right? You're not normal. Or, you're an Indian American and you get confused all the time. Your name gets confused for the other Indian American that works in your office, right? You're not an individual. You're a black man and walking into an elevator and people clutch their purses a little tighter. You're a threat. Someone walks into a room and touches a black woman's hair and says, "Oh my God, your hair's looking so great today," right? On the surface, it's a compliment. Under the surface, you're a curiosity, or you're not normal. Someone says to a gay man, like, "Oh, you don't even look gay," right? Maybe trying to compliment, but underneath the surface, like, you're not normal. You're so articulate, right? What? It's just a compliment. But under the surface, it's communicating you or people like you are inadequate. I didn't expect you to be articulate, so I'm so pleasantly surprised, right? So these are the things that are being communicated under the surface. So now for some interactivity, what I want to do is I'm going to play you a clip. One of the clips I talked about doing interviews on the streets. I'm going to play you one of these clips. They're really short. And have you think about what's being communicated here, right? Under the surface. And then we'll do a little poll. Okay, so here's the clip first. Hopefully it comes across well on Zoom.
Professional, that's another thing that can be trying to be a compliment. You're very professional. Like, what does that mean? Like, as opposed to what? As opposed to who?
Hi. Could you hear that, Cara?
I can hear it sounded perfect.
Okay, good. All right, so let's see what you think is being implicitly conveyed here. You can choose more than one also, okay? Is it you're invisible, you're not an individual, you or people like you are inadequate, you don't belong, you're a threat, you're a curiosity, you're a burden, or you're not normal? Give everyone a minute here.
Or getting answers, I just want to acknowledge there's some great comments going on in the thread here and people taking care of one another in the chat and talking about all the places that microaggressions or that subtle acts of exclusion show up in their own lives, like in their marriages. And
oh, wow, yeah. I can relate. That's one place where I'm the one committing them. Which is an important point. We all commit. I mean, subtle acts of exclusion are going to happen. You know, we don't want to create an atmosphere where we expect them never to happen and then we're shocked. We're going to do this all the time. If we're really trying to connect and bond and live with people who are similar to us and different from us, we're going to have subtle acts of exclusion happening all the time. And if we expect that, we can be prepared and we can actually practice good ways of responding. And we'll talk about that too. Okay, we've got lots of answers here. Let's take a look. All right. So most people said you or people like you are inadequate. Yeah, that resonates. And you're not normal, you don't belong. Absolutely. So what you can see is any given subtle act of exclusion might be communicating many of these things at the same time. And we wouldn't fully know unless we talked to her and asked her what she was feeling in that moment, right? And it might be she felt one way when one person did it, and it happened another day and she felt a different kind of thing. And then a different day someone else said it and it didn't even bother her. Like, these things are complex and complicated because we're humans, right? Okay, now let's go to the next one.
Professional, that's another thing that can be trying to be a compliment. You're very professional. Like, what does that mean?
That's not the next one. Here we go.
There was a patient and he refused to speak with me. I was in an all-Caucasian office, and he refused to speak to me, and I said that was fine. He has that right. I handed my information over to my next employee who was Caucasian. Everyone there was, and she took care of him. And when he went back to the hygienist, he said, "Oh, wow, you got one of those spray-on tans. You're almost as dark as that one," speaking about me. And I said, okay. And the doctor just let it go. There was
Okay, so now I should clarify here. Refusing to speak to someone because of the assumptions about their identity or their race, that's not a subtle act of exclusion. So when I'm asking you what subtle act of exclusion is being communicated here, I'm talking about that second part of what was said, where you said, oh, you're almost as dark as that one, like making a joke or comment about her appearance, right? So what do you think is being communicated there? Stephen asked a great question in the chat. I'm seeing now, if you're curious about people's origins, can you ever do that? Or is that always a subtle act of exclusion? I have thoughts. Cara, what would you say to that?
I think when in doubt, maybe don't. But I also think maybe the bigger thing is like, as you get to know people, naturally you find out more about them. And so I think if you come from a real place of integrity where you just like are want to get to know someone better as a friend, then you'll automatically learn that. But I guess the question about like, I just love knowing about people's origins is kind of like a why? And asking yourself that question too about, what is it that you gain from it? And I think maybe if you get a little bit deeper, like, oh, I just said, I love to hear about different countries and things, like, then you can ask a question that's not necessarily like, oh, so where are you from? But where are you really from? Like, you look like you could be this, and thinking about kind of the root of the question that you want to ask. And again, leading with kind of like actual intention to get to know and understand the people that you're speaking with.
Yes. And yeah, exactly. And, there are ways of asking that are recognized as subtle acts of exclusion right now. Like, oh, so, what are you, right? Or as, and people want to be treated as an individual, as a person. Later on, when we get to have a relationship, as you're getting to know more about me, great, you'll be learning about all kinds of things about me, including maybe, my heritage. But just like out of the blue, kind of like, what are you? Is often taken as a subtle act of exclusion. And so always just having in mind, how is that going to feel to the other person, right? Think about it like that. It's not just, well, you're curious and you want to know, right? But how is it going to feel to the other person? Keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think Sandra has a good comment on that. Someone may constantly be getting that question, and another person asking, even with good intentions, feels like a buildup of something that's already in existence for them. So yeah, I think the idea, we'll talk about empathy a little bit later, the idea of empathizing.
Exactly. And are you asking that question really of everyone, or is it certain, groups of people specifically? All things to keep in mind. Okay, so let's look at what people said for this. You're not normal. Yeah, absolutely, right? You don't belong. You're a curiosity. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. So the idea is just to, keep thinking about what might this be conveying to the other person, or if something similar happened to you. Here's the last example.
Absolutely. It's one of those things where you start talking to your counterparts, and no longer are they talking to you. They're talking to, the other male in the room, or, someone else that, they can relate more with, especially if it's from different cultures.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Here we go. What might be conveyed with this one? You're invisible, perhaps. Yeah. I saw everyone jumped on that one right away, because I can see as they come in. Right. And obviously, let me just say, I have, like I mentioned, I did 100 of these interviews, and so we have people talking about things related to all different dimensions of diversity. And so it's not, we kind of picked ones that are kind of focusing on race in some way here, but they're focusing on all different dimensions of diversity. And that's really important to recognize. Now, why are they happening? Well, let me just show you these results first. You're invisible, you don't belong, you're inadequate. Yeah, absolutely. So the idea here is to practice that muscle of recognizing these and what they might be communicating to people. Why? Well, first, because if they're not happening to you, you might not even recognize them when they happen because they're subtle. And if we're trying to create a culture where people say, no, it's not just on you to talk about these when they happen, to educate people about them, it's on all of us to point it out when it happens. We all should be being allies. Sometimes you just got to do that first step of getting people to recognize what they even are, right? And then giving people a language for being able to talk about them. So, hey, when you said that, I know you were just maybe meaning this, but it made me feel like I was invisible, or it made me feel like I didn't belong, or it made me feel like I wasn't normal. Having that language is so important in terms of having a productive conversation, and we'll get to that in a bit.
Yeah, I saw Mark asking the questions also just about like, is it the doctor also who's committing that subtle act of inclusion? And I am curious about your thoughts, but it seems to me that it's not the doctor who committed it, but certainly he's amplifying the notion that you're not normal if he doesn't say something.
Yeah, and he's
I think we'll talk more about that too.
Yeah. The critical thing is he could be interrupting that and saying something and is not. And, because he employs her, like it's actually his responsibility to speak up for her. And so it's really egregious. So I'm thinking we don't quite have time for this. Would you agree? I
think you might be right, but it makes me very sad.
No, me too. So we were gonna do an activity where we put you in a breakout room, and you got a chance to share some subtle acts of exclusion that you might have experienced, or observed, or maybe even said and gotten some feedback about. That's really nice to do, to be able to share, to feel heard. I mean, that's why we call this connecting with empathy, to feel heard and to feel seen and to be able to share those things. We kind of knew we were cramming too much into this presentation and we knew we might have to cut this, but I would encourage people to think about subtle acts of exclusion that you've experienced and felt, and have conversations about them with others. And to be clear, I want to make sure to really clarify one thing that's important. There's a whole world and range of discrimination, exclusions, violence, and they're not all subtle acts of exclusion. Some are totally overt. Some are totally intentional, right? That's not exactly what we're talking about by subtle acts of exclusion. So those have to be addressed, but those are often more visible than these subtle acts of exclusion. So that's why we're drawing attention to these in particular. We're not saying these are the only things to notice and watch out for, but there's something that flies often under the radar and a serious problem. And so that's why we're specifically calling attention to these, because they really do impact the way people are connecting. Okay, so wanted to make sure we get to strategies for doing something about all this. Yeah. Okay, and the first one, of course, is
I do want to say I'm going to forgive us.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Cara. Are you there?
Oh, sorry. I think I got lost for a minute, but I'm going to forgive us for skipping over it, because I know a lot of the people here are in community together. And I think it's our challenge for all of you to go back to your communities if you're on the call with people which I think a lot of you are, to have those conversations. And also keep typing in the chat, because it looks like there's some good, fruitful sharing happening there as well.
Yeah,
all right,
good.
We can move on. Thanks.
No, that's great. And another caution, if you're doing that in those groups, it's really important to just really listen to people and it seems so easy and obvious, and there's nothing easy about listening when it comes to topics like these. People, if they're sharing something really emotional, really painful, really personal, really vulnerable with you, you've got to take that seriously and listen without trying to filter it through your own experiences or your own perspective. Listen without thinking about what you're going to say, you know, in response. Listen without feeling like you've got to jump really quickly to action. I mean, I'm terrible about this. I always want to jump to the action. What are we going to do to fix this? But listening, just listening without feeling like you need to do that. Listening without like counter arguments or playing devil's advocate. Don't play devil's advocate with topics like this. Don't do it. That's really important. Okay, just wanted to say that. Now, interrupting subtle acts of exclusion when they happen. This is really important. I think you were going to talk a little bit about this, right, Cara?
About interruption. I think you can go ahead with this part. I'll start. Oh, no, right here. Cool. That was what I was going to talk about.
I can talk about it too, but you go ahead first.
Well, so these 5 tools are the 5 tools that we use at Mosaic for conflict resolution. But reading Michael's book and seeing some of the things that he talked about, they actually align really closely. And I think that's because, I mean, conflict resolution, I think we tend to think of like it's 2 people against each other, but conflict resolution, when something arises that needs to be dealt with, that's always a form of conflict resolution. So yeah, I think how we deal with subtle acts of exclusion, and I think this is kind of like, you can talk about this for when you're trying to interrupt a subtle act of exclusion or when you're experiencing one. And I want to acknowledge here too that for Black people, a lot of times it feels really unfair to have to deal with this, because it's like, I'm already being oppressed. There's already a subtle act of exclusion that's happened to me. And now it is incumbent upon me to deal with this. And that feels terrible. Like even just watching the videos of those women feels terrible. And at the same time, to your point earlier, unfortunately, we are uniquely qualified because we have the unique, benefit of our experiences, which is a true benefit, but also can feel burdensome in and of itself. So I just want to own that it doesn't necessarily feel good to have to do this, especially if it's happening to you directly.
Right.
But with that said, because we do care about ending oppression and because we do want these things to change, it is often in our best interest to deal with these things as they arise. And I think the first thing to do is to stop and take a moment. Laura and I had a conversation earlier about the fact that like sometimes you do have to say something in the moment and you don't have a whole lot of time. Like, we tell the kids like, if you can stop and take a break, if you need a break, you can take one. A lot of times if you're in a room, I remember being in an organizing event once where there was a very clear kind of like microaggression that went out to the whole group about Black people. And I was just like, well, if I let this slide, like what am I saying to everyone in this room about what's going on here if I don't address it? But I think taking the time to at least take a breath and let your mind calm down just a little bit, taking a moment to stop and think about what's happening is really, really, really important. I think the difference between 2 or 3 deep breaths can be the difference between like catastrophe and coming to a real conclusion. So I really recommend, this is my new obsession, just like take a breath, take a couple of moments, even if it's all you have is a couple of moments, take those. We talked about listening just a moment ago and how hard listening is. And conflict resolution, this is a little bit different because it's like you have to listen to the other person, but here it's all about like listening to the person who experienced it and trusting that experience. And then also talking. So if you've experienced it or if you've witnessed it, how do we talk about that? With our young people, we often use I statements, which I know some people are like, oh, I statements, what is this, like therapy? But like, honestly, right, the most effective way for people to understand how something impacted you, as someone was talking about impact and intent, which we'll talk about a little bit more here on the other side too, is to talk about how it felt for you. It's very hard for people to argue with how you felt. I felt hurt, I felt sad, I felt I felt angry. Like those are all things that are hard to dispute. And I think I'll use, like Chris had an example, I think up here about what happens when someone's like, you're feeling invisible because a group of adults or sometimes kids are looking to the white men in the room for answers, even when others are speaking up. So you can use your I statements, but you can also kind of use this effective messages template, which is like, I am observing that most of the kids who are being called on in this room are, or is it the, yeah, like I noticed that most of the time, the person who's we're looking to for the answers is the white person in the room. The impact of that for me is feeling like I don't have anything valuable to contribute, even though I care a lot about this and I think I have a lot of information to share. Could you be more, or are you able to be more thoughtful about that process, and be more thoughtful about bringing in different voices, be more thoughtful about calling on someone other than the white person. And I think you can also do that with an I statement where it's like, I feel hurt when I see that, you know, none of the people of color are being called on. And so I think you speaking from a personal place, being able to actually talk about what happened, talk about the impact and not the intent, to your point earlier. So it has nothing to do with what anyone wanted to happen, it's only about what happened actually and how it felt to the person who received it. And then making a specific request about how you want that to change. And that's kind of like goes into on the 5 steps of conflict resolution slide as well, the planning, right? So it's not like we're just gonna say like, you know, oh, my bad, but like think about how are you gonna do this differently? And at Mosaic, we talk a lot about respect. So looking again, respect, which is an again, and spect, like spectacle. So when we say respect, what we're really talking about is looking again and never getting complacent or comfortable that a person was the way they were, like the way they were before is going to be the way they are in the future. And also that the way that you understood a person to be because of your own understandings of the world, because of your own prejudice and stereotyping and unconscious biases that we all have, are the correct way. So that we're going to like break that down. We're going to take that break and stop ourselves and catch ourselves when those feelings start to arise. And then empathize is in there. I'm kind of going out of order, but empathize is in there because we have to be able to understand what other people are feeling. Oh, and maybe my connection's unstable and you can't hear me. We have to be able to do our best to understand what others are feeling.
Yeah, we could hear you perfect. At least I could. Can you hear us?
Cool.
Okay, you're back? All right.
Yeah, I can hear you
okay
too. So sorry. I see thumbs up. Thanks, guys.
No worries. Thank you, Cara. I love what you said. And I love there's so much alignment between the way you were just talking about this and the way Mosaic approaches this and the things we wrote about in the book, which is fantastic. And, you know, with subtle acts of exclusion, I think one of the keys is that kind of stop, like also just stopping the action, even if you don't know what you want to say yet, like just not letting things slide, especially, you know, also if you're, I mean, you talked about how if you're a Black person and you might not feel like educating someone else, especially if you're an ally, maybe just stepping in to say, hey, you know, other white person like me, that was messed up. Like we have to do that work, right? That's really important, especially like there might not even be another Black person. There might not be a Black person in the room. You might be in a room of all white people and somebody says something messed up and still you've got to stop and say something, right? There have been so many spaces where white people have been allowed to say things and not get called on it. And it's partly why it just gets perpetuated again and again, because people are comfortable saying those things and there aren't social consequences. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I see Sabrina's asking a question here about how do you talk about feelings and raising an issue, especially when that can be used to say that we're reinforcing a stereotype like women are emotional, or I think the one that comes to mind for me is obviously Black women are angry.
Yeah.
And I think there's kind of 2 ways to deal with it, which is one, you go with the more kind of like, you know, effective messaging. This is what happened. This is the impact. What do you want to happen now? Or I think you also, if you're feeling brave, can address the fact that that stereotype may be invoked and say, you know, I'm angry because there is a reason for me to be angry, not because I'm an angry Black woman, but because this is a situation that is upsetting, because I have been, you know, whatever, because, and then talking about the impacts very specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I mean, the reason that subtle acts of exclusion are so hard, I think for a lot of people, is because there is a lot of plausible deniability, right? It's like, oh, that's not, nope, that's not what it was this other thing.
Right.
But again, like when you talk about the actual impact and you focus on impact, it's hard to deny that like what the impact of the thing was hurtful. And to trust that for, you know, people of color, for women, for LGBTQ folks, for overweight folks, or for people who are just like considered unattractive in our society or for some reason, like they have experiences with these issues.
Yeah, that's great that you're saying that. You know, another thing that comes to mind with subtle acts of exclusion and being able to interrupt them and speak about them is I want to emphasize the responsibility on the person that's getting the feedback that they said something that made someone else feel bad. Like that's where the responsibility should be. And if we all get in that habit of, okay, you know, someone is risking their own comfort and taking energy to point out something that we did that made them feel excluded. That's a gift, right? If we're all in this project of trying to become better people, it's a gift that someone speaks up and says that to us, and we should acknowledge it as that, kind of. I mean, it sounds a little silly, but like it's great. It's great feedback. And we have to get in the habit of not being defensive about our intentions, right? Yes, of course, most people are not waking up in the morning trying to be a jerk, trying to exclude people.
Is that not when you get out of bed, you're not just like, another day to be a jerk?
not usually. But like, we know that, right? And so what if you could put away your defense of your intention and try to understand the impact on the other person, at least first. Like you might get around to your intention at some point, but that shouldn't be the first thing you're focused on. And you have that responsibility. Okay, so that's really important. We could go on and on about this. Let's talk about some other things.
Let's do it.
Okay, so other things you can do. Diversify your networks and your media. I mean, Kara talked about segregation that happens, or segregated spaces, or social segregation. You need to diversify your networks and get different perspectives and understand what people are going through. And that includes your media consumption and where you get your news and everything. Because if you think about your own, you know, like your go-to networks, for example, like who do you go to when, like, you know, you really need a trusted person to talk to, right? Something big is happening, or you want to share something deep. Who are you going to? Like, sure, there are a lot of people in your network, but who are you going to when you really need a trusted perspective or a trusted friend? Who are you going to when you got to get something done fast and good? You know, who are the people you go to consistently? Like, we all have those people. If you took a moment, you could think of who they are. And if you were being honest with yourself, you know, you could write it down and kind of analyze, like, how are those people similar or different than me, right? In terms of race, gender, sexuality, disability, family status, age, all of those things. And, you know, it's not bad to have go-to people, right? Sometimes it helps you get stuff done. They're trusted. There's a level of trust, and that's really important. But just think about who's in that network and how you could potentially diversify the network. Obviously, you're not going to go up to someone and be like, hey, you're different from me. Could you be part of my go-to network, right? These relationships are built up over years. But you can start getting different perspectives and in your network and having more contact and building up more occasions for trust to be built. And then maybe you can get to the point where you do have a more diverse network.
Yeah, I mean, it's true, you can't build it overnight, but you can start now. And so you absolutely can take a moment to, or like, you know, put yourself in situations where you're going to meet people who are different. And I want to acknowledge, like, that often means discomfort. I think a lot of like things that happen is like people are like, well, that makes me uncomfortable. I don't want to be uncomfortable. Like, that's like where we grow. We talk about that with the kids all the time. The comfort zone is where you are boring. The discomfort, the stretch zone is what we call it. That's where you grow, and that's how you get better. And I think talking about like right now in this moment, there's a lot of folks who are like sending text messages to Black folks to say like, hey, you know, I see that, can I do anything? Or like, can you tell me about how to get involved? Like if you can think about the fact that like, if these people are not your normal friend group, like if you really have no idea how they're doing because you never talk to them, then probably there's some room for you there to like start cultivating those relationships in a more meaningful way. So that way, when a crisis happens, is not the only time that you're interacting with them.
Yeah. Yeah, and something else that is fresh on my mind, because I was just writing about it recently in a piece for White Allies, is also, if you're checking in on Black people that you know, maybe don't ask them to take care of you. Like maybe just a simple like, hey, thinking of you, love you, right? Or, you know, yeah. And like, don't ask people to educate you on things. There are so many resources out there to do the work on your own. I mean, literally, you can type in crazy questions into Google, like, why shouldn't I touch a Black woman's hair? Like, and you get amazing resources within a nanosecond. Like, it's never been easier to get information. You don't have to burden other people to teach you.
Yeah, I do want to, it's the last thing, I know we're going to move on, but I want to absolutely, like, there are lots of ways to educate yourself now, but also like going back to like putting that into action and putting it into practice is just like super, super important. Like you can read every book in the world, but if you aren't actually like connecting with people, I don't think it's going to have the same impact as if you're actually like going across those lines of difference. And I see lots of people talking about like books and media in there. I hope that everyone reads all of those beautiful recommendations, but also like feeling like if I've read the book that makes me an ally, like you've got to take the actions, you've got to build those relationships, and you also have to interrupt those subtle acts of exclusion. That's, you know, that a true ally makes.
So true, so true.
Go ahead. I know we're going to talk about media, and I see one of my very good friends is in the chat talking about this challenge that we're doing about living June in color, which is a bunch of us are trying to consume only media and art and lots of things, food, from people of color in this month. And I was going to talk about it because you're talking about here, like consuming diverse media. And for someone who's in the middle of, you know, consuming more diverse media than I ever have in my whole life, it's really exhausting. And I think the reason it's exhausting is because just so much of what comes to us easily is not diverse media. Like when you pop open your phone, like I get New York Times updates, or even the news updates on my Apple phone are generally from, you know, news sources that don't include people of color. Or when I pop on Netflix, I mean, right now everyone has like the Black History edition of Yelp, but like, but generally when you pop open, you know, whatever things you are using to consume media or book lists, it's just very, very, very not diverse. And so you have to work, like even finding out like a workout person, like all of these things where you just have to put double the effort in. And so like shifting that is really important too.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for that. So we're running out of time, so we're gonna move quickly. Just making conscious, trying to bring from the unconscious realm into the conscious, your biases, when possible. So I won't talk about it. There's an implicit association test. If you haven't done it, you could check it out. It's free online. The Harvard folks do it. It's not perfect. You'll do it and it'll tell you like, you're slightly biased in this domain, or you're very biased. It's not a perfect assessment of your character or your unconscious biases. In the aggregate, it shows some really interesting trends, but take it with a grain of salt. And communicate with people. I think this is related to what you were talking about, Cara. Like you have to put this into action. You have to talk to people, connect with people about these things, including children from earlier ages than you probably think it's appropriate. There are age appropriate ways to do this. And, you know, you can get children's books, for example, that are incredible, from, telling historical stories about, oppression and things that are beautifully written and talk about the real history, and it can help you facilitate some of those conversations. I mean, this is kind of what you all do. Like, you want to say something about that?
I was going to say that Mosaic just put out an action guide on their website. If you go to mosaicproject.org, you can find it pretty easily. There's an action guide with some of our curriculum and also some questions. Specifically, that was a big part of doing this, is that it's 18 hours. Is that you be able to actually like take in some information and be able to have conversations with your family. So I really, really recommend that if you haven't seen it.
Yep, I second that.
Maybe actually, Laura, if you want to throw that in the chat.
Yep. And then finally, right on time, all the other things you can do to change structural inequality. Vote for people who talk about that and want to address it. Protest when it's not equal. Advocate to change those structures. So, want to close? Well, what would you say in closing, Cara?
I would say, I think we talked about this, we were joking about this earlier, that is that meme going around of like, when it comes to racism, just like, it's like coronavirus, just assume that you have it. Like, obviously we all have different levels and different ways that we've been affected by society and have different unconscious biases. But I think if we operate under the assumption that we might have something to learn in an area and take that pause and try to catch ourselves when things are happening as much as possible, we'll do better than we have done.
Yeah, great. And I just also want to, echo those sentiments and just say thank you for spending this precious time with us. This has been really, even from the chat, like I'm getting a sense of all your energy and connection. And this, this is a long journey we're all on, and let's not lose momentum or passion for really changing the paradigm of justice and equality in this country so that everyone can be valued in the same way. It's super important, and it's kind of an incredible time in that respect. So thank you all. Really grateful for you being here.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Michael. This has been lovely to talk with you, and your book is amazing. If you want to share a book that people should read, you should go read Subtle Acts of Exclusion by Michael Baran and Tony Jana.
Thank you. Thank you, Cara. That's very sweet. Thank you. And thank you. This has been really fun.
Yeah.
Okay. Good night, everyone.